Welcome to the Daily Coffee Pro by Mapper Forward, friends. Today on the podcast, we're talking about an industry that's built on entitlement and race. What an interesting time to be discussing this issue. So in setting up the next few episodes for what we're going to be talking about, I want to talk about the history of our industry, but together with that, I want to explain that this week on the podcast, so the next 5 episodes, we're going to be talking about the future of the coffee industry. In doing that, we can't talk about the future without understanding the foundation of what the industry is built on. So, in this episode, we're going to be looking at what that foundation is. And in the next episode of the Map It Forward podcast, we're talking with Darren Daniel, the Executive Director of Cup of Excellence. The reason I wanted to have a conversation with Darren is twofold. We are seeing that even in the time of COVID, that Cup of Excellence is progressing. And I wanted to understand how that's going. And given that this is the first year that the Cup of Excellence has gone to Ethiopia, that's really important. The other reason I wanted to talk to Darren is because I want to explore the idea of where is the power being held in coffee and how is it being distributed, especially at a time like this in the history of the world where we're experiencing COVID-19 and the effects of that on the value chain, as well as a lot of the veil being lifted off where race issues lie and where disparity lies within our value chain across the entire thing. I thought it would be great to explore some of these issues. So today we're going to have a look at the history, and we're going to do a brief history. So if you look at it, where did coffee come from? So it started in Yemen, the first kind of proper production of coffee on some sort of scale. It certainly wasn't mass scale, but it started in Yemen in the 15th century. And it was a commodity at the time that was traded locally. It was something that naturally occurred, and it was seen in places like Yemen and Ethiopia to be a seed or a tree that was seen as something that you were not allowed to deliberately plant and cultivate, especially in Ethiopia, because it was seen to be a divine offering. It was something that was gifted to us, and so therefore we should just treat it as divine and only pick from the trees that sprung up. That's what some of the sources say anyway. It was at that time not a commodity that was being traded across Europe or any of the Western countries. It was something that was picked and distributed typically amongst the Sufis and other Muslim travelers as they were heading to what's called Hajj. And Hajj is the pilgrimage that Muslims commit to doing once in their lifetime as they travel to Mecca. So coffee was the replacement for alcohol for Muslims in local sort of African, Middle Eastern regions as what they drank on the way to Hajj. It was what Sufis would drink to invigorate them as they were whirling dervishes for 12 and 14 hours. And it became something, as the Ottoman Empire started to take over, it became something that they would drink in coffee houses. That then led to the Arabs as they were growing their empires. They added coffee as a part of the things that they were trading with spices. So it grew there, and as it grew, it became popular amongst Europeans as the Arabs took it with their trade to Europe. Now, it wasn't until the 17th century that you started to see coffee being produced on a more mass scale. As the mass scale of coffee production started to take place by the Dutch, the French, and the English, you started to see more kind of insidious trade practices happen. And I am obviously oversimplifying this a lot, but this is the foundation for the next few episodes. So I wanted to give you a very brief history. We then saw as the French, the Dutch, and the English started to colonialize different countries, because they saw that coffee was becoming a very popular and very profitable commodity in their countries. They started to go into countries like Haiti, and they would go in there and they would bring in slaves from Africa as they saw that coffee was booming, and they would proliferate Haiti, countries like Haiti, with coffee plantations. And what you started to see was this sort of practice as coffee became more well known as a beverage across the world. You started to see more and more and more of this going on in different places. Europeans would go in, they would find where coffee was naturally grown, and they would, or the climates and the terroir where it was perfect for coffee to proliferate, and they would start colonializing those areas, or it was a part of their colonization, and they would plant coffee, use slave labor, and they would profit highly off of this. So as this started to happen, things went in two ways. You saw coffee become highly commoditized and become what it is today. And we still see that in poorer countries where coffee is a natural kind of crop that they grow over there, the labor costs are much lower than what the labor costs are in many of the coffee consuming, or the more the greater coffee consumption countries. So you have this commodity in a country like El Salvador or a country like Brazil, where it's not particularly well drunk in those local, it's not a locally consumed, I apologize for tripping over my words, it's not a locally consumed product as much as it is in places like America or Australia or in Europe. And because of that, a lot of these coffee producing companies can't see the value chain to its end locally. It becomes an exported commodity. And we took advantage of that. We pay very, very low prices historically for coffee to the producers, and we tend to charge a lot for it in the consuming side of things. It's not all a terrible story. What we did see was it was in the coffee plantations in countries like Haiti, where slave labor ship was taken from Africa and taken to Haiti purely for the production of coffee. You started to see this was an opportunity for things like the Haitian Revolution. And that is one story that started off terrible, but eventuated into the freedom it was the self-driven freedom of the people. They liberated themselves. And okay, that's a great story. And it's historically something that the Haitians should very well be proud of, that they were able to liberate themselves from slave owners because of coffee plantations. But not a lot has changed. We still see indentured servitude in coffee producing countries. And in times of COVID, this is exacerbated when healthcare becomes really important, and you start to see that this is no longer it's no longer something that, well, let me put it this way. In countries where the price of coffee is less and they're not being subsidized adequately for their labor. And by they, I mean the employees of coffee farms as much as I mean the producers, the owners of the coffee farms. The dependence on their well-being during a pandemic means that they have to choose between eating and healthcare, if healthcare is even something that's available to them. So we're starting to see that the entitlements that we're afforded in coffee consuming countries versus coffee producing countries, there's a wide gap. And I want to also say a lot of this is very nuanced, and while we're giving a very very brief overview here, I do encourage you to go and start looking into this. If this is an industry that you're in, you owe it to yourself to understand the history of the commodity that you are trading in. And by trading, I mean either brewing or roasting. You are still participating in trade. Now, another thing, the entitlement isn't just at the producing end or the lack thereof. On the consuming end, we have a particular sense of entitlement over the producing countries, mostly. But we also see a sense of entitlement, and we spoke about this in previous episodes of the podcast. We also see a sense of entitlement over the workforce on the consuming side of things, where we see in particular the baristas and roasting employees or employees of roasting companies are living on minimum wage. And in a lot of places, minimum wage is not a livable wage. This is exacerbated by the fact that on average, coffee businesses operate on 3% net profit. And we're going to explore that in episodes throughout this coming week. But we have an industry that's built on a sense of entitlement. And we've got to start looking at what this moment in history offers us so that we can start breaking down not only some of that entitlement, but breaking down the gaps, the big, massive, gaping gaps between having a business and finding success or having a career and finding success. People are coming into this industry expecting one thing. They land here and realize, well, there's no real money in doing this. The sense of community is nowhere near as real as what we think. And let me just stop on that for a second. When we talk about community in the coffee industry, I want us to get real about what that really means. We wax poetic about how the coffee industry is all about community and being together, etc., etc. And yet, when somebody does something innovative, we want to crush them. We want to bring them down. When someone comes up with a new idea, when someone wants to explore something that we perhaps haven't talked about before, we all come together and destroy them. Why do we do that? If we had a genuine sense of community, we would be elevating each other. We would be looking to find ways to celebrate and bring each other up. And so I want you to ask yourself, like when we talk about community in the coffee industry, what do we really mean? And is it real? You may have a group of friends who agree with you, but a real community doesn't just have like-minded people. A real community is welcoming. It invites people who don't look the same as them. They're connected by a common thread, and our common thread is coffee. And yet it's like you can be a part of our group, and this is particularly for specialty. You can be a part of our group if you agree with this and this and this and this. Let's not be like that. Let's ask ourselves personally. We can only change ourselves, but let's invite ourselves to ask, like, do I participate in that? I certainly have in the past. In my early days as a barista, dude, the only way that I can get better is by recognizing how I fucked up. So I invite you to step into that and ask yourself, am I participating in something that I should be moving on from? Should I be finding a way to create an actual community rather than telling people that they should be thinking the way that I think, or unless you follow these rules and do things the way that they're supposed to be done, which is defined by who the fuck knows, then you're out of the group. That's not a community. Anyway, I hope that this has kind of sparked some ideas for you moving forward. These episodes of the podcast on the Daily Coffee Pro are purely meant to help spark your pondering, and hopefully they encourage some discussion between you and your colleagues. Peace, love, and peanut butter, friends. Have an amazing rest of your day.